Welcome to our community forum hosted by UConn Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the Marijuana Policy Project. My name is Jennifer Burden. I am currently the president of UConn Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We are an international network of students dedicated to ending prohibition and creating more sensible drug policies centered around health and human rights and harm reduction. Today we have a panel of lovely, wonderful guests here for you today. We have Carol Ann, we have Zach, we have Representative Greg Haddad, and we have Sam Tracy. So, yeah.
One day we'll be on a first name basis. Maybe by the end of this forum.
Hopefully. All right. Well, I have my questions on my phone, so I'm not texting, I promise. All right, so I just wanted to start off asking some questions, and then we'll open up into a... Actually, Richie, do you want to leave that open for me, just in case anyone else wants to come in? Thank you. So I'm just going to start off with a couple questions, do some introductions, and then we'll open up for a Q&A so that people from the community and from the school can talk about any questions that they might have about the bills or about legalization and regulation in general, and share your thoughts for all of us to hear and discuss and keep in our minds when talking about this legislation in both this session and in the future. So my first question is, would all of you lovely panelists tell me a little bit about yourselves, the work that you do, and how you are connected to this issue? Whoever wants to start.
I'd be happy to start. Hi everybody, as Jenny said, my name is Sam Tracy. I'm actually a UConn alum. Used to be a member of the SSDP chapter here, graduated in 2013, and now I'm working as the director of the Connecticut Coalition to Regulate Marijuana, which we realize is a mouthful, and it's just Regulate Connecticut for short. And what that is, it's a group that's backed by the Marijuana Policy Project, which is a large national organization that's been working to pass marijuana reform in Connecticut and across the country. So all sorts of marijuana reform, things like medical marijuana, marijuana decriminalization, but now legalizing and regulating marijuana for adults over 21 is pretty much the main focus. So MPP has been involved in working on these campaigns in many other states, all of those that have been successful so far. I mean, Colorado is the most famous one, of course, everyone talks about, but we've also got Oregon, Alaska, and Washington that have already had their programs already up and running. And then, as you probably already know, in November 2016, 4 more states, Nevada, California, Maine, and Massachusetts, all also passed them. MPP was involved in a lot of those, so now it is just really exciting to be working back on this issue back in Connecticut, and hopefully bringing this really sensible drug policy to our state. And if Connecticut does pass some of these bills that will be, or one of these bills that we'll be talking about tonight, we would be the first state in the entire country to pass it through the legislature rather than a ballot initiative. So that's a particularly interesting and exciting opportunity, and something that I'd love for everyone in this room to try to help with.
Awesome, thank you, Sam.
And I'm Greg Haddad. I'm the state representative from Mansfield. I've been the state representative of Mansfield now for 6 years. I'm currently serving my 4th term. I serve on the Appropriations Committee, on the Government Administration Elections Committee, and I'm currently now the chair of the Higher Education Committee at the Capitol. Enjoy my work. We're generalists. To be honest with you, we have to learn a lot about a lot of different issues. We tend not to be experts in any of them, but we're elected because we're trusted by people in the community to use our best judgment to sort of figure out what the best thing is to do up at the state capitol. I've, as a legislator, been involved in this issue primarily because of activists like you from SSDP and Sam. Sam's taught me almost everything I need to know about this subject. I represent Mansfield. That includes the campus of the University of Connecticut. I try to be responsive to concerns that people bring to me, and this is, part of that effort, part of my responsibility, I think, to you. There's a couple of House bills over here and a Senate bill that we'll talk about a bit later. I was proud to help be one of the co-introducers of one of those pieces of legislation, and we'll get a chance to talk about that later. And about like sort of what I think the prospects are in a general sense for making some progress on this issue this year. I look forward to having a conversation with you.
My name is Zach. I am a graduate student in the sociology department. My research interests kind of look at issues of economic development, sort of the relationship between the state and various economic outcomes. I'm not exactly an expert on legalization, but or particularly knowledgeable on it, but I hope to provide a sociological perspective on the relationship between drugs and society, particularly in relation to criminalization and a lot of the racialized effects of prohibition. I think it's had a host of poor outcomes, particularly for already vulnerable populations. I'm not particularly as concerned about the sort of corporate profits, and although I do think there is a lot of economic advantages, tremendous economic potential. I'm hopeful that legalization and the economic development that comes with it is part of a larger project of racial and social justice that sort of fights some of the problems that have been going on with criminalization.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Jackson. I'm also a graduate student in the sociology department. And in terms of my research interests, I deal mostly with race, urban studies, and looking at like the school to prison pipeline. So in terms of marijuana, like in the legalization process, I'm also not an expert, but I do have a lot of knowledge base in terms of like the prison industrial complex and better understanding how this is situated as a racialized problem, the roots of prohibition as a racialized issue, and media framing, and understanding this a little less from like I guess the political side per se, but understanding like the socialization behind how we have come to frame looking at weed as possibly a problematic drug, to understanding it and the role, how it's evolved kind of down to, you know, being more acceptable. Like in the media, for instance, we see a big shift from the way that it was framed previously in the stereotypes into how we see it today, much more acceptable. So I'm also here with Zach to kind of shed a little bit of light, understanding, I think, those nuances and the background for not only why we should consider legalizing it, but also why it's so important and the impacts it has on our community. And also from a personal standpoint, I'm from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and so I've seen, I think very personally, the devastating effects that over-policing and the arrest rates have had on the community. So I think it's important to advocate that from a social justice perspective as well.
Thank you so much for your personal perspective on that as well. We really appreciate you sharing. Our next question are, what are your opinions on cannabis legalization and regulation that you've seen and observed in other states currently? And how do you see some of those models being incorporated or not incorporated into Connecticut's legislation?
So I'm happy to dive into that a little bit, but just of talking about, as I said in the intro there, that a lot of states have done this now, but every one of them seems to always kind of want to reinvent the wheel each time and like put their own spin on it. So in a way, it's kind of nice for Connecticut to be coming in at this phase because there's a lot of different examples to draw from. The idea of states as laboratories of democracy, essentially there's all these other experiments going on that we can kind of pick the best parts of. And so as a couple big examples, I mean, one thing is that in Colorado, that's the one that's grabbed the most media attention because their program has really thrived the most out of all of the ones that are up and running so far. Part of that's just because they were able to really hit the ground running because they had a really established medical marijuana program in the same way that California is probably going to be doing in the next couple of years because that transition's a lot easier when you already have all the infrastructure up and running. And one thing that I think we could really learn a couple of the mistakes that's been done in, say, Colorado and Washington. In Washington specifically, their program got off to a really rough start, mainly because they set the taxes incredibly high. It was something like maybe 50%, while in Colorado it's about 35, or Washington actually was about above 60, I believe. Colorado was about 35, and for perspective, Massachusetts, that just passed it, is 12. And so there's a wide range there. We'll see if Massachusetts sticks with 12. But with Washington, they who knows why they did it. I mean, some people, they just thought that was the right number. Some maybe got greedy with the tax revenue and wanted to generate as much as possible. But it actually just led to people not buying in stores legally. Everyone just kept buying on the black market. So there was not the kind of tax revenue that they expected because just no one shifted over into the legal market. And so that's a really important thing that I think Connecticut has to look at, is trying to balance those concerns of both wanting there to be, high enough taxes to raise money off of it, and some people think of it in the same way as, cigarette. It's good to have kind of high taxes in order to dissuade use, but at the same time, you don't want it to be so high that no one goes to stores. And so I think that's one really important aspect that we have to be looking at as we do this in Connecticut.
Thank you, Sam.
Just related to that, how far are we on taxation issues in the discussions in the House? When should those take place? When should we intervene?
Maybe we'll get there, but let me say a couple of things first. I've joined the legislature, as I said before, in 2011. And I think I've been there for the two sort of steps forward that we've made already. First was decriminalizing marijuana, small amounts of marijuana. So, we adopted a policy that said, if you have, a walking around amount, and you get, it's going to be an infraction and not a criminal offense. And that gets at, I think, some of the issues that maybe we'll hear about more. And then subsequently, we took the step of doing medical marijuana. Interestingly enough, we did that after. I actually thought, when I first got there, medical marijuana was the easier, more sensible step first, but we did it reverse. 20 states have decriminalized marijuana, small amounts of marijuana in the states. 28 states have done medical marijuana. 8 states now have legalized its use. So, it's becoming easier and easier, I think, for Connecticut to consider this next step because we have so much more experience to look at around the country. Right now, the bills that are being considered are in their very initial phase. There will be a robust conversation about things like what Sam was talking about. What should the tax rate be, and that sort of stuff. These, when bills are initially introduced, are oftentimes introduced they're called proposed bills. They're really just a statement of purpose, not the full legal language. 2 of the bills that have been introduced they're in the process of drafting, and so there'll be more of a concrete proposal, and we'll go through the public hearing process and fine-tune the bills to sort of address those kinds of issues. For me, this is not an issue about taxation, though. I mean, I we are in the midst of a pretty serious budget crunch at the state capitol. That's to say the least. In the 6 years that I've been in the legislature, we've had a budget deficit every year. This year, we're looking at closing a gap of about $1.4 billion. And that's an intimidating goal. But, legalizing marijuana, we're talking about something probably in the range of $50 or $60 million of revenue. That's value, and that's a big number. But to me, it's not a compelling enough reason to go ahead to try to solve our budget problems. I'm much more moved, and I think many of my colleagues as well, are much more moved by the idea that that young people, in particular, still even having decriminalized small amounts of marijuana, are finding themselves in the criminal justice system. That costs us a tremendous amount of money as a state, but more importantly, a lot of potential for young people who just, many of us you just don't really belong in the criminal justice system. And that's, to me, a more compelling reason to go down this road. If there's some tax revenue, then, that's great, I guess. But it's not, I certainly don't want to think that for a lot of us, that's not the motivating drive for the reasons for going down this
I want to make 2 points. First, about the I'd like to think that this conversation and also the topic can expand beyond just looking at marijuana into general drugs. And so that, as well as the need to compare not only between states, like we were saying about states being a democracy or a state's laboratory, and think of other countries. So Portugal, for example, has decriminalized not only marijuana, but a lot of drugs and focused less from criminalization to treatment. They've seen HIV plummet, they actually have less drug use, even though it's decriminalized, less people in prison, more treatment for addiction, had a lot of really positive effects. And my second comment on the program of taxes I'd be afraid that marijuana taxes could turn into another poor tax. We have a lot of poor taxes, and thinking about taxes that target people that already don't have a lot of money. So sort of other regressive tax systems like sales tax, cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes. I'd be very hesitant of a bill that may have revenue, and even if that's not the main motivating factor, but just getting its revenue from people who are already suffering economically.
Yeah, I think another point to be made, going off of what you said about the taxes, and while it's not a top concern, I think that the reappropriation of the funding is something to actually get excited about. I mean, if we are no longer investing the money that we do in terms of housing inmates, processing the arrest, it is a lot of money that we put into this. And if we can reappropriate that into the education system, I mean, I think that there are a lot of other issues that affect a wide range of people that we could greatly benefit from if we reappropriate that funding. And especially if you consider the way that the criminal justice system is racialized. So while we have seen nationally, we've seen that arrest rates have begun to go down in some places. Where where it's legalized, there are no arrest rates. But even when arrest rates do go down, you still see that blacks are disproportionately arrested, and Latinos, right? So this is still affecting minorities. And so I think that it's also important to understand that even in light of legalization, we have to also make this right, there's a justice issue here that needs to be spoken about, I think, in terms of how is this disproportionately affecting some citizens in our country. And so I think that that by, if we have extra funding, for instance, like the urban education system is something that isn't directly related, but it all ties in, and that's just one of the many things that we could reappropriate the funding to.
Thank you so much. I definitely agree with a lot of that. So my next question, and there's a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to community and audience questions. So if we can just hang on to those or write them down until then. I have a pen if you need one. So my next question is, how do you think that legalization initiatives will be affected under the Trump administration? And how do you think we should respond or push back against that? I'd love to hear your opinions.
So I'll jump in. I don't think anybody can project what's going to happen with the Trump administration. And anybody who tells you that they can is you know. There's a joke here. I guess I'm going to do something. We're smoking something. I'm dealing with a lot of issues. Is one that also affects a lot of your fellow students around immigration, right, and whether or not we should be what we should be doing with dreamers and the like. We've got a bill that we're working on in my committee, so I've been working a lot with a group of undocumented students here at the university to provide them some greater access to institutional financial aid. I raise that it's not a complete non sequitur. During the campaign, Donald Trump promised that on the very first day of his presidency that he would undo the executive order around deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is what the small amount of legal protection that dreamers get in this country right now. We're still waiting for that to happen, and it's odd because here's one of the central issues of his campaign. He's delivered on a lot of anti-immigrant promises, has left this group of people alone, and I'm pleasantly surprised, I guess, but we're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. On this issue, our Attorney General is, you know, to my mind, not the most enlightened person in the world. You know, I anticipate, frankly, that there will be a crackdown on states that have taken any of the you know, steps that we've taken. Medical marijuana is possible. Decriminalization is possible. Certainly legalization. What form that crackdown will take? You know, how will they try to sort of withhold you know, federal funding from states, or you know, otherwise sort of incentivize us to not go down this path? I think we're still sort of waiting to see what happens. You know, it seems to me like with withholding federal funds, which is the most likely tack that they will take to try to discourage states from taking these actions, has its limits too. There's constitutional limits on the amount of money that they can refuse to send to states and jurisdictions. And so that works, I think, to our favor, unless they can get a law passed. And a law will pass, it means that they need to get the 60 votes in the state and the Senate as well. And so it's a little bit, you know, for the real harsh stuff, I think that has to go through the whole process, through the Congress, and not just be happened by executive action. So that I think will make it a little bit easier. But I don't know yet. I don't think anybody really knows what will happen in reality. But I think we can probably reasonably expect that they'll take some action.
Thank you.
I also just want to add, I think that when I think about the move to legalize marijuana, I think about it as a social movement, and I think that ideologically we're seeing a shift in the way that marijuana is being framed from something that is, you know, stereotypically corrupt, degenerate, you know, all the conceptions to seeing that it has medicinal properties. We're seeing the benefits financially, economically, and so I think that in terms of maybe moving away from this, in terms of more going back to more of a prohibitive measures, that is quite possible, but I think there's a lot of power in the fact that we have a social movement with many supporters, and that there's that shift might not be just so abrupt where all of a sudden it's a hard crackdown. I mean, I would hope not, but I think that with the way that we see where public opinion, it really does matter. And we have started to see a shift, so I think we may be progressively moving forward, even if it slows down versus entirely backwards.
I think that is a really good point, because there are definitely some worrying things about the Trump administration. I mean, a lot of you probably saw in the news maybe a couple weeks ago that the press secretary, Sean Spicer, made some comments saying that he expected greater enforcement was the term that he used. But that's still really ambiguous, because I mean, that could mean, okay, we're gonna crack down, because I mean, as you probably all know, medical marijuana is still totally illegal under federal law. That's something the states, I mean, 28 states have done it, but if the federal government wanted to, they could shut all of those down, legally speaking. But that greater enforcement threat is kind of looming over us. We don't know if that means cracking down on state legal programs, or if that just means kind of more resources being poured into fighting against people who are breaking even those state laws. Because I mean, even in Colorado nowadays, there's still raids that the state police do in coordination with the feds, because there's a lot of people, I mean, just like when it's totally illegal, but there are a lot of people who are having, you know, unlicensed grows, who are shipping it out of state. So there's still a role for law enforcement even after legalization. And so there's still the potential that that's kind of what they were more talking about. And within the marijuana movement, I think it's good to be cautious and worried, but we don't want to kind of jump the gun too early, because, I mean, during the campaign, Trump himself said that I'm a states' rights guy, I want marijuana should be a state issue. And he made those promises, as we've said, he doesn't keep all of his promises, obviously, but if that's one that we can pressure him to keep, I think that there's still the opportunity to do that. And Spicer's comments might have been a little bit more of a trial balloon. There was a really good poll just last week, I think it was Rasmussen, that found, I believe, 63, or it was in the high 50s support, I think 59% nationally for marijuana legalization, but 71% oppose federal interference in state laws. So there's still a decent number of people, over about 12% who say, okay, I don't support it, but if a state wants to do it, the federal government shouldn't crack down. And that includes a lot of Republicans who have the state rights values more. And with Trump having been surrounded by a lot of those folks, I'm hoping that they're able to pull them in that direction. And as far as how this impacts the debate in Connecticut, I do think it's obviously worth continuing this conversation, hopefully moving forward and passing this law. And I guess there's a small part of me that hopes with a heavily Democratic legislature that maybe Trump opposing us might be a good thing, that it could be kind of a way to stick it to the Trump administration, but I'm not a legislator, so I can't really speak to that.
Well, let me just say one thing about that, because we used to be a heavily Democratic legislature in Connecticut, but we're not anymore. In the last 8 years, we've lost actually 30 Democratic seats in the House, and so right now we have a 7-vote margin in the House out of 151, and the state Senate is tied between Democrats and Republicans. And so, I actually think that in some ways it's led to a lot more conversation about ideas at the Capitol, and that's good. But we're not Massachusetts anymore.
Even if Connecticut's not a state like Massachusetts, as far as having, I do think it is something to say that it's one of the last sort of liberal places. And as far as thinking as we move towards states' rights, and as we ask the question, what is the role of the state? Can or should the government be a force for good? Asking that question and being in a state like Connecticut where there is that chance of that, I think it's important to be asking those questions and think and recognize that these liberal states who want more government services are also the ones who are subsidizing conservative states, paying more in taxes and receiving less in benefits. So I think that it's important when we're asking ourselves what is the role of the state for liberal states to make their ideas present in their legislation. Sure.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to switch my questions around a little bit. The next question I have is, what do you personally believe is the most important aspect of why we should regulate cannabis? Like, what personally about legalization is what is motivating you to do the work that you are doing? What impact does it have on you and your community and the people around you that makes you believe that it's important?
So I'd be happy to start with this. And I mean, there are many reasons to support this issue. But to me, it really does come down to harm reduction, which is basically kind of an overall philosophy, just that, if people are going to be engaging in a certain behavior, that we should do everything we can to reduce all of the harms associated with it. I mean, so it's the same kind of philosophy that on campus, that you're all forced to go through the alcohol education program when you come into school, even though obviously it's illegal to drink when you're under 21, but the school recognizes that, okay, people are going to drink anyway, so let's make sure that they know how much of this cup is one standard drink, so that people aren't drinking a giant cup full of vodka, for example. And so having that kind of harm reduction philosophy, I think, is completely ignored with the policy of marijuana prohibition, because the idea being essentially, I mean, and this is something larger with drug prohibition more broadly, but specifically with marijuana because of the relative harms associated with it, that it is objectively safer than alcohol in some of the most important ways in terms of it's impossible to fatally overdose from it, it's slightly addictive, but it's nowhere near as addictive as alcohol or nicotine or opiates, and a lot of the other side effects that come along with use can really be defrayed by doing things like vaporizing, consuming edibles instead of smoking the product, which obviously, I mean, there's a lot of debate about exactly how harmful it is, but I think it is kind of commonsensical that, burning something and inhaling it's not the best for you. And so if people are going to be using marijuana either way, which they clearly are under marijuana prohibition, I mean, marijuana is significantly more popular today than it was when prohibition started. It's no less available, it's no less potent, it's actually more potent now because of in the same reason that during alcohol prohibition, people drink liquor instead of beer because it's easier to smuggle and easier to produce. And so in the same way, marijuana prohibition has really led to increased potency because that's how the incentives work. And having the lack of regulation, it's both harmful for consumers. I mean, buying something on the black market that you don't know, there's probably mold in it, there's probably pesticides not meant for human consumption that were used in its production. There is a small chance, I think this gets overblown in the media, but it does happen, of it being laced with other drugs. There was someone in Massachusetts, Brockton, Massachusetts, just last year, a guy who was arrested for selling marijuana laced with fentanyl, which is a very addictive and dangerous opiate. It's insane to me that anyone would do that, but it does happen. But if you walk into a liquor store or a marijuana dispensary in Colorado, you can be 100% certain that what you're purchasing there isn't going to have fentanyl in it. And I think part of the role of the state is protecting consumer safety, but prohibition has not only avoided instituting those protections, but has actually, as we've been talking about, been harmful in and of itself by destroying people's lives, throwing them in prison for a plant. Even if you don't go to prison and have an arrest record, it's harder to get a job. It's if you receive a drug conviction while you're receiving federal student aid, you lose that student aid. So be careful. That is still a policy, and so a lot of the policies of marijuana prohibition have both essentially made it impossible to protect consumers while also just harming citizens overall. So I really think that kind of like the medical profession, that first do no harm should really be an ethic of the government as well. And it's pretty clear to me that marijuana prohibition is incredibly harmful. So that's kind of my main reason, is that, I mean, you want the government to be doing good things, but I particularly would like the government to stop doing bad things.
I'd also like to personally note that I don't think that K2 or other synthetic cannabinoids would be nearly as popular as they are if cannabis was regulated. So it's kind of, I think, a given. People wouldn't feel the need to do spice or find a legal alternative that's a lot more harmful than the cannabis plant itself if we had a regulated cannabis market. So whoever wants to continue, please just.
I think going off of that, when we think of harm, it's right, there's different types of harm. There's the physical aspects of it, and then again, we can think of it from social justice aspect. And when we think of the prison industrial complex, America has the highest rate of like in terms of imprisonment of individuals, specifically Blacks and Latinos. And I don't want to be the squeaky wheel that keeps saying that, but it's important to understand that also when these individuals are arrested over something like a marijuana plant, when they are 15, their lives are being thrown away. So as I said, like for me, it's been more than just even an academic interest, but I've personally seen in my community lives that are being destroyed or just altered for the worse because of the arrest rates or because of the difficulties with the legalization process. And furthermore, I think it's important to understand how that then there impacts a young boy's future or a young girl's future for the rest of their lives. I mean, it could possibly throw it away. And we have to ask ourselves, is that worth it? I said the reappropriation of funding is important because these children are going to schools that are failing them, and then they're being thrown into prison for, I mean, that's not to exaggerate, this is really happening. And also, we have to understand that corporations also make a lot of money off of, like, it's privatized prison industrial complex, right? So that's also something that's really important to understand, that when these people are arrested and they're thrown into prisons, that they're then also being used to basically work for 17 cents an hour at times to do some type of work for corporations. So it's much more than just, I mean, to me, it is about harm, but like how deep is that harm? Do we understand all the contours and nuances of the way that this impacts people? People are growing up without parents in their homes. And in some states, we're seeing that, in fact, when they have legalized it, that the usage is going down. we see so many benefits, and in terms of even the medicinal properties of it, that I think it's just really important for us as a community, as citizens, to realize the different ways that this impacts people. And so that's always been close to home for me, because if I want to improve my community, one of the first things I want is protection and not policing. I don't want people to continue to have to worry about these things when in fact they should be afforded protection. They should be afforded opportunities and mobility to do better in life. I mean, I've seen kids, they are like the brightest kids that I know. I mean, they're really, really, really intelligent, they're compassionate, they're great people, and at the same time they have to constantly worry about surveillance from the police. Where if we eliminated this as an issue, this will be one more step in the right direction that I think is so, so important for us as a country. I think we have done a lot to come far and to realize that we have to right a lot of our wrongs and injustices. And I think that when we think about this as an issue, we can't just think about it. I mean, we could think about it in economic terms. We could think about it in the fact that there are children who, like, we've seen the stories, right, where young children have been able to take cannabis oil in their seizures, like things like that, where it's just like, wait, let's rethink this, down to the social justice issues. So I think that there are so many benefits from it, and that's one of the main reasons that's very close to home for me. And also just, I mean, it's so much more than a research interest, quite frankly. So.
Kind of building on Kara's point, I really want to, I think it's important to stress that criminalization and prohibition is not like a new issue, especially for communities of color. Like the idea of criminalization of police violence, this is not a new issue. This has been going on for a while. It may have became recently brought into the public eye, and now that it's more acceptable, and now that white use of marijuana has gone up a lot, now is when it's becoming legal. I think that's really important. It's important to understand that. So I am critical of that origin. Of why it is that we're now talking about this, is because it's also, now that white people want it, now we want to do it. I'm critical of that, but I do think that as long as we maintain that focus on racial justice, I think that it could be a force for good. I think there's a lot of room for entrepreneurs in the marijuana industry, and many of these issues have been systematically denied, particularly to blacks, but also to poor people in general. So thinking in Colorado, for example, it's a very unique stratum of people who have had access to open up industry, who have had access to reap gains from the marijuana's expansion. So I think it's very important that I'd be especially critical thinking of the economic development, and as we're building these bills, I'd be especially critical of a laissez-faire approach that ignores the racism of the systematic historic racism behind prohibition and how we got to where we are in the first place.
I can't speak more articulately than these folks did about those reasons. I think I said earlier that the potential of prematurely entering the criminal justice system, or not just prematurely, but unnecessarily entering the criminal justice system, is something that I think is reason enough to sort of consider putting it aside. I'm consistently impressed with how Sam. So comes the harm reduction stuff, I think is really important as well. And then of course, and if it raises some revenue too, then that's great too.
Thank you very much. I think there's been a lot of interest lately, probably to do with what Zach was mentioning about how it's becoming more into the public eye based on media attention that it's receiving, the fact that more white people and more legislators are thinking about regulation, and there's a lot of financial interests and economic interests behind it. And we, I think, as young activists and people interested in social justice and people who might be lobbying on a state level, need to think about how we can incorporate laws into the system that bring the people who are most harmed by the war on drugs, particularly cannabis prohibition, back into the market so that they can have jobs. And I know that this will create a lot of jobs. That's another really big thing that people are always talking about. Republicans are always talking about. We need more jobs. People are losing their jobs. Technology is phasing out all of these jobs. Well, I don't know how technology would really, I mean, I'm sure there are ways and people will come up with them. Technology would really be that prevalent in the cannabis industry, that people will be growing and producing with their own hands. So that's, I guess, another thing to consider. Sorry to butt in. My last question before we open it up for audience to ask their questions and receive their answers is, what suggestions do you have for those of us who want to get involved with this issue? Like, where should we start in terms of affecting policy changes and having our voices heard? What can we do?
So I'll jump in on that. So there are 4 bill numbers that are written over here. Only 2 of them I think are still relevant, but those are 4 different pieces of legislation that were introduced this year that go down the path of regulating marijuana. 2 of them, the top 2, SB 11 and 5314, I think are still alive in the legislature. So one of them is is a bill that was introduced by our Senate President Martin Looney, and it's being considered in the Judiciary Committee. That's Senate Bill 11. And they're currently drafting that, which means that they're adding all the detail that we talked about before. Still waiting for a public hearing. The other 5314 is a bill that is a proposed bill that's being considered in the Public Health Committee. And that has been introduced, proposed by actually a Republican, Melissa Chevron. So that bill is up for public hearing next Tuesday, March 7th. I would say that at the very least, if you're interested in this issue, you can come to the public hearing. You can think about offering some public testimony. You can stand behind somebody who's offering public testimony. You can catch members of the General Assembly going in and out of the room and saying, here's what I think about this issue and why I think it's really important. I suspect many of you come from different places across the state of Connecticut. You can walk up to the right desk and say, I want to talk to my state senator, I want to talk to my state representative if they're available, and talk to them about your issue. You can email them or call them. I find personally as a legislator that, again, since we're asked to know an awful lot about a lot of different issues, that a real conversation with 1 or 2 of my constituents can make a big difference. And you should know that was potentially you can make a big difference if you have that conversation with your legislator. That could be someone from here. You're all constituents of mine if you live here at the university. But you have the unique ability. I'm already in the SCOM. Your unique opportunity to go back to where you come from, your hometown, and talk to your home legislators, because that can make a big difference too. We get lots of email and stuff that are form emails, that run by groups that think that maybe the best thing to do is to get 100 emails that say 100 times the same thing to us. To me, that's not effective. What has been effective is the personal connection from somebody who's really educated and interested in this issue, talking to a legislator. That can be very powerful. So, those are things I think that you can do. But talking to your own legislators is chief among them.
And yeah, as far as a couple other things or other ways to get involved, I mean, Greg did a great job talking about how to get involved with the legislative process. Taking a little bit of a step back and how to get involved with this more broadly. Joining UConn SSDP if you're a student is definitely the best way. Just talk to Jenny afterwards, I suppose. And the meetings are actually at this time every Thursday, every week. So if you're here now, you're available on Thursdays at 7. I highly recommend checking out SSDP. A couple other ways to get involved too. So the group I'm working with, Regulate Connecticut, our website is getting its finishing touches done right now, so it's not live yet. We do, though, have a placeholder up, so just if you, early next week, if you go to regulatect.org, just regulateconnecticut.org, we're going to have a volunteer sign-up page, ways so that you can kind of get linked in with the rest of our coalition. And we'll be sending out different alerts about public hearings, opportunities to contact your legislators, other ways to get involved. Even things like if you like writing, write some op-eds, whether it's for the student newspaper here or for other newspapers in the state, local ones like Willamette Chronicle, State, Harper Current, or even letters to the editor. I mean, those are less than 150 words. You basically make one point about something you read. And so if there's something interesting that you really agree with and you want to support, you can write about that. If there's an article you disagree with, you can refute some of the points. And people really do read those. And I think it's really important for having those be part of the conversation. So really just depending on what your own skill set is, there are a lot of different opportunities. But on the legislative side, I mean, Greg obviously knows far more than I do about what legislators listen to, but I've heard from pretty much everybody that phone calls and face-to-face conversations are pretty much infinitely better than emails. So emails are better than nothing, but if you're trying to get involved, like pick up the phone, and if you're nervous to be on the phone with somebody, call when the office is closed and leave a voicemail. They'll listen to it in the morning. And that's what it's a good way to get some training wheels. And then once you build up to it, then you can call during office hours.
We also have dynamic phone scripts that you can use, and they're not necessarily cookie cutter. You can divulge from the basic script, but it's good to go off of. So if you want any of those, I got them.
To add on to that, so how many people here came with a friend? Can you raise your hand? Okay, and most of you at some point, right, this was word of mouth. You had to hear about it somehow, right? I think one of the most important things, and usually underestimated, I don't want to sound cliche, is telling people about what you know. Become educated about this and tell others, because in terms of social movements, we see one of the most important things, like whether it be like civil rights movements, women's rights, right? Just a few months ago, we had the march, the Women's March, right? And what we see is that when people are communicating with each other, and I mean, and having networks of communicating, getting the word out, educating people. I don't know, and some of those conversations can be difficult. Sometimes someone might not at all ideologically be on the same page with you, but that conversation can start the shift. Or just talking to someone who maybe you haven't talked to about it, and that information is invaluable, and spreading it, because I see a lot of people here, and I'm so happy that you all came, but there's a few empty seats here too, right? So inviting more people and saying, hey, I'm going to this event tonight, that is so powerful, because as we build up a base, there really are power in numbers. And yes, voting is one mechanism to get your voice out, but another is to let people know what's going on, and to continue to do all this, to encourage your friends to make those calls. And I think that's one of the probably maybe understated but most important tactics, and honestly easy. It's simple. It doesn't require a degree. It doesn't require money. It just requires you to care and to talk to someone, and can really make a difference.
Adding on to you two, one of the key, another way of communication that I found, I'm from Pennsylvania, and Senator Toomey, and one of the things that was really popular tactic in Pennsylvania, or at least the Philadelphia region, was faxing. We faxed Toomey so much that like, there were things, and it was particularly with Betsy DeVos. And I think that was an effective tactic. It's really annoying to get a lot of faxes. So that's another tactic. But building on Kara's point, I think it's really important to recognize that change can come not only from within the legislature, within the political system, but also beyond it. So thinking about what sort of action can I do, and what can I do, and how can I do, and even if it's just talking, even if it's just a political sort of shift or a cultural shift, that's important action. I want to say something, and I remember when I first heard this, I took social movements class as an undergrad. My professor told me this, and I remember thinking, what are you telling me this for? You're completely wrong. But he told me, he said, I'm sure you're all busy, and we all, as students especially, we're all busy at classes, clubs, organizations, a lot of people work. I really encourage you to contextualize these commitments. Students, especially traditional students who don't have families and full-time jobs, are often the leaders of social movements and are often one of the biggest members of them. And if you look at the 60s, anti-war movements, and all civil rights movements, students are at the center, at the forefront of a lot of these things. And although you may feel like you have no time to do anything, and I certainly feel that way, so I'm kind of speaking, maybe I should be telling myself this as well. But many of us have less
Come to
commitments
SSDP
than,
meetings.
many of us less commitments than we ever will in our lives, or at least for a long time. So keep that in mind next time you see a Facebook event or your friend wants to talk about something. Keep that in mind. Students are big.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, please.
There is another way that I agree entirely with like getting involved with an organization that can help keep you abreast of what's going on in the state capitol. And I really agree with the idea that sometimes leadership isn't about, getting the legislature to do something, but like making a change in your own community and changing a couple of minds. And I really appreciate that all of you come out to sort of talk and listen about this issue. I'm interested in getting on to like hearing a little bit about what your own thoughts are and what your own questions are. I did also just want to acknowledge that that sometimes legislators don't get invited to sit on the panel; they get invited to come. And Mae Flexer, who is our state senator, is in the back of the room, I know that she's here because she's just as interested in learning about what your perspective is on this. I also know that she lives almost in Rhode Island. Sometimes I think she actually lives in Rhode Island. And she has another, although that she wouldn't be in our state senate if she did live in Rhode Island. And I know that she has to leave soon, but I just wanted to acknowledge her presence as well, because she's done a really good job at sort of, with me, at trying to sort of figure out like how we can best represent students here at the university. And just wanted to make sure that you all knew that she took the time out of her day to stop here and sort of say hi, like listen as well.
Thank you, I really appreciate it. All right, awesome. So now I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Wow, lots of people. Is it my job to pick? I saw this lovely lady in the salmon shirt raise her hand first. So.
Hi, I'm Dagmar Knoll. I'm from Willimantic. I have a comment and a question. I heard a lot about liberal support for this, and I think it's often much easier for liberals to support this, but I do want to point out there is a bill in the federal government right now, in the legislature there, for that was put forward by Representative Tom Garrett, who's a Republican from Virginia, and it is co-led by Tulsi Gabbard, who's a Democrat. So there you have a bipartisan bill that's coming forward, and I was alerted to this by my conservative-leaning libertarian friend, who would never describe himself as a liberal, and I was told about this forum by a libertarian friend. So you might know, I think.
Wouldn't be surprised.
So my point is, if you think your liberal friends are just easy sells on this, don't discount other folks. There are a lot of people who are interested in this issue for a number of reasons. And if you can get their support and get them on board and get them to talk to their conservative legislators, this then becomes not a partisan issue, and it's much easier to get through. And my question, my main interest here is on decriminalization. I actually don't indulge in marijuana use at all, but I do, I'm going to ask another question that I haven't heard anything about yet. I do indulge in alcohol drinking from time to time, which is essentially drinking poison, but it is legal. And if we are going to be regulating marijuana like alcohol, well, the tobacco industry is poised to take over and profit from this as much as possible. Is there going to be, I know this isn't popular right now, but a grow your own for a certain amount, just like we can brew our own to share with our friends? Is that going to be part of regulating marijuana like alcohol, where we can grow a certain amount of our own for personal consumption? Or is that so far out there? Because I think the tobacco industry is not going to want that. And that's something to be thinking about, as I know that's maybe way out of the edge, but just a thought. Any thoughts on that? Anybody? Yeah. What is it in Massachusetts?
Yeah, 12, 6 points, mature, 6 points mature.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah, so that is a really good question, because the home grow aspect of this, I think, is a really important part of kind of how different states have approached it. And the vast majority, all of those 8 states except for Washington State allow home grow.
Okay.
And so my hope would be, as Greg has said, the bills aren't fleshed out yet, so all they say is regulate marijuana like alcohol, basically. I think some of the summaries didn't mention home grow. So I hope and would definitely personally be pushing for allowing that, because, I mean, I consider myself kind of a progressive libertarian type, mainly because I work mostly in drug policy, where that's one of the areas where you can be that. But basically, the freedom and liberty side of this, I do think that it is just absurd to send someone to prison for growing a plant. And so, even though we have decriminalization in Connecticut, you can possess a small amount of cannabis flower, but growing even a single plant, even if it's this tall, is a felony. You can still go to prison for growing a plant this big. You probably won't go to Cal when it's this big, but if it starts actually flowering, any amount is still a felony. And so that, I think, is a really important part, just from the personal, like, civil liberties side of things, but also on a practical side too, because quite frankly, marijuana is very expensive. And for a medical marijuana patient, we don't allow home grow in our medical program. States are kind of a patchwork on the medical side, but say I was a patient in Connecticut who doesn't have a lot of money, insurance doesn't cover medical marijuana because of federal prohibition. And so I could be paying many hundreds of dollars a month or even per week, depending on how much you need. And growing your own is a really good way to defray those costs. And so in a sense, allowing everyone or all adults over 21 to grow their own would actually be really helpful for the medical population too. And as far as the connection with big tobacco, and I mean, I honestly share those concerns, kind of the same ones with big alcohol. There's definitely some interest from those industries in this, but one of, obviously, federal prohibition I would prefer to end as soon as possible, but one of the strange kind of side benefits of that is that while federal prohibition's in place, all of those big companies, Philip Morris, Budweiser, they're too scared to get into this. They have too much to lose. And so it kind of creates this opportunity for small businesses to get their foot in the door first, so that when federal prohibition comes down, there's going to be an established, like, medium businesses who have been doing this for a while that aren't big tobacco and big alcohol. And I really hope, I mean, this is kind of the next phase of the drug reform movement, and with marijuana specifically, is then, once you legalize it and regulate it, then you kind of have to take more of a consumer advocacy side and make sure that the industry doesn't do anything bad and shady. And I mean, that's true with any business, particularly ones dealing with drugs, whether it's pharmaceuticals or alcohol or whatever. But I think that is important to keep in mind that, the battle doesn't end with legalization. That's still just one more step on this.
Let's be realistic right here, right now. United States, they got 2.4 million people in jail right now. 2.4 million jail. United States population is only 4% of the world population. And we have 22% of the inmates. For every 1,000 people, for every 100,000 people, we got 800 people in jail. Now, let me ask the easy question. In the United States, crime is one of the job creation. From Willie Manti, I get arrested, you got the police, you're gonna get paid for that. Then I call the government to burn me out, you're gonna get paid for that. Then we got the prosecutor, the judge, the jail, who built the jail, who provides food to the jails. And then you got the secretary, you got so and so, you got the CEO. You talk about big jobs. Plus, 80% people in jail are drug related. They don't have for kill the wife or kill the husband or for a spy. They are 80% are for smoke marijuana, to that thing. Now, if this bill passed and we put 2.4 million people back in the street, we had that bill include education for those people that go back to the street. And second point, all those police officers that are going to get fired, all those people that are going to lose their job, that bill include to rehire or to training them. Now, and the other point is, I'm from Willimantic. In Willimantic, we have around 22,000 people, 40 police officers. for that means for every 400 people to one police officer. If you move next town, Lebanon, 7,000 people. Colombia, 4,000. That is 7 and 4, 11. They have only one state trooper. To be honest, white people smoke more marijuana than black and Latino, but not informing. If I go to Willimantic with that man, I smoke marijuana, I'm going to get arrested in 1 minute. You go to Colombia, in the lane, you get your weed, the police will enforce it. For that reason, if you black like me, you got million people we arrested that are going to be white in Colombia. But let's go to the point. What are you going to do? What's the plan in this bill to be training 2.4 inmates that are going to go back to real life? And how are you going to do to create jobs for those millions of people that are going to lose their jobs?
I know there was one thing. I don't want to be the only one that talks on the subject. I think it's really important and deserves a lot of attention. And that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. I think that we need to adjust for the historical wrongs that came with this, that come with prohibition. But the one thing I think of is in Oakland, and I don't know how successful it's been, but they found ways to privilege ex-cons, or not ex-cons, formerly incarcerated people who were convicted of drug crimes, and found ways to let them or help them open up dispensaries and help them get involved legally in the business. I think that's one way of, I haven't seen how exactly that was implemented, but I think that's one way of keeping this, of making this, of sort of righting some of the historical wrongs.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I mean, there's a lot of different factors here, but one of them is really one of the big problems and great tragedies of marijuana legalization I've seen so far is just that, we've spent all of these decades incarcerating black and brown people for selling marijuana, and then we legalize it, and then the only people who have access to this industry is already rich, 99% white people. And I really want to make sure that if we do this, that we do it right. And I think some of the best ways, there is the idea of community reinvestment, using some of those tax dollars to go back to the communities that were disproportionately targeted. The law in Massachusetts did include something in there saying that some of the money does have to go back to spending on education and things like that in those targeted communities. But I really do think that one of the best ways is essentially being able to have there be low enough barriers to entry to opening up a dispensary that a normal person could, without having $1 million in the bank, which is actually basically what's necessary in a lot of these states. And especially if you're someone who got busted for selling marijuana when you were a teenager, and you spend a bunch of years in prison, you get out, you don't have the money to get involved in this business. It's still federally illegal, so you can't get a small business loan from your local bank to open this up like you could with a bar or a restaurant or something. And so making sure that this new industry is actually accessible to everyone, not just rich people, frankly, I think is really important. And yeah, so I think that is one of the major areas. It does get a little difficult when comparing Connecticut and the rest of the country, because those stats are totally true nationally. Connecticut is, obviously not perfect, but we have done a lot of really good work, especially Governor Malloy, his second chance society idea of we've reduced incarceration here a lot, but especially in states down south in particular, I believe it's Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are kind of numbers 1, 2, and 3 as far as the incarceration rates, and so unfortunately I think a lot of that won't get fixed until we have a federal law change, just because those states probably aren't going to do it before the federal government, and so we really do need to bring them along.
I'd like to get someone on this side of the room. How about this gentleman in the back?
I'd just like to touch on that, the question about what happens with all of those jobs. So realistically, a lot of those jobs are things that are paid with taxpayer money, like police, public prosecutors, judges. When there's less work in those industries, then there's more funds for other public services. So things like subsidizing job growth, subsidizing businesses, you would kind of, that money would be reallocated publicly because those are already public funds. So that would directly contribute to public development.
And actually, I'm glad that you brought that point back up, because there was one thing I was thinking of when you were asking the question and I got sidetracked. But with those jobs, and I can't speak to this as well as some other people, there's a really great group out there called LEAP that used to be Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They pivoted and just rebranded, actually. Now they're the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, but they still cover the drug war. And it's a lot of former police officers, some current, but mostly former, who speak to these issues. And their founder, Jack Cole, we had him speak at UConn a few years ago. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it is shocking of how few crimes are solved nowadays versus 30 years ago. Even with, you know, advancements in technology like DNA evidence and that kind of thing. But the number of murders that are solved, the number of rapes that are solved, it's actually, the percentage of those has gone down very significantly. And so I do think it's important that, you know, when marijuana prohibition isn't something we're spending police time on anymore, it probably does make sense to, you know, maybe reduce the police force and spend some of that money hiring some more teachers. But on the other hand, you don't want to get rid of, you still want to be spending a decent amount of money on policing, because then they can steer their efforts instead to, you know, solving sexual assaults, solving murders, solving important violent crimes. And so they're harder to solve, and I mean, that's kind of the reason that we have so much incarceration and arrest associated with marijuana prohibition, because it's really easy picking up a teenager or someone on a street corner that's smoking, a lot harder than solving a murder. And so it's a pad statistics that kind of get steered towards. But I do think that we'll be able to actually improve criminal justice in terms of bringing more, you know, violent criminals to justice if we get rid of this nonviolent crime.
I just have a quick question. I think to answer your question, I think that the legalization of marijuana is a piece of the puzzle, but if we really want to talk about systematized racism, the policing of black and brown bodies, that's when we realize that this might be the start of a conversation in terms of a step in the right direction, but I think that's why we need to also be engaged with conversations with Black Lives Matter, say her name, because this is just the beginning of the conversation. It's a piece of it, but we're not going to see, like, and I think that you're making a point with your question at the same time, that these issues aren't just going to go away. We have a long history of these problems here, and I think that if we have more involvement and awareness and an investment and collaboration between movements, that's a step in the right direction to figuring out why are certain bodies going unbothered and protected versus some bodies are policed and, you know, and others are not. And so that's just to touch on that, because I do think that it's a step in the right direction in terms of certain people not being policed the same way, but we see increases even as arrest rates have decreased. They're still extremely high for Black, so it's not just going to go away. It doesn't just stop the problem.
Even as crime's going down, incarceration's going up. So.
Any more questions?
Yes, I would like to ask, what would you say is the right level of kind of passion versus detachment when you're trying to fix a social issue like this? I've seen videos on the internet of people chanting, "Do your job," person is really not getting an answer. Does that really change anything in the long run? In your opinion, does that kind of force get the job done or make someone kind of change their policies, or is it much more useful to come at something just with a very personal story in a very calm, detached way? Because that's something I'm struggling with, to keep my emotions in check and be able to come at something calmly when I see so many stories that are basically just designed to create fear and get the most money.
That's a good question. I mean, if you're talking about legislators in particular, yeah, I mean, like, we're all just people. I mean, I don't think there's a one uniform answer to that. you do your best to sort of create a personal connection with the person that you're talking to. We try to figure out if you know someone that they know, learn a little bit more about their family background, something like that. And I can tell you that, like, when we sit in public hearing testimony, we hear public hearing testimony, we might listen to 100 people during the course of the day, and legislators might all have a different person, or a different kind of approach that would make a difference to them. I'm not sure there's any one size fits all answer to that. I mean, I would say that if you're in a room and you're yelling, do your job, you probably lost that person. Because I can only presume that there's something that they're not doing that's sort of causing you to start chanting that. But for the most part, I don't think a dispassionate conversation with somebody is what I would suggest. I would suggest, like baring your soul, giving people an honest assessment of what you really think and why you think it is the stuff that really, I think, would have the most impact. Even if that, we had a public hearing on higher education 2 weeks ago, where we heard lots from students who were coming in to talk about funding to public universities and so on. And I can tell you that, like, it's, the students that came up, and they could have been very, very safe and said, very sort of boilerplate language about why school is important, why UConn is important to them, why community college is important to them. But the students who came up and said, there's one guy named Jamil. He's from Central. He said that his brother was in jail. And we talked a little bit about what it meant to him to be approaching graduation and knowing that his brother was such an important figure in his life, just wouldn't get to watch him graduate. And we're human beings. We listen to that and we think, that affects us, and it's not a dispassionate plea to help him get through college. It's actually just quite the contrary. But I think that's the stuff that really helps. So I would just say, like, stuff that comes from the heart that you think is really important, and it gets at why you think it's really important is the stuff that's really most basic. Thank you.
Is there anyone else on the panel want to answer? I think we have enough time for one more question. Christian?
I was curious, I've recently read an article showing a correlation between at the national level between how many people are incarcerated for drug offenses and their disenfranchisement regarding the voting rights. So I was curious, what is this connection at the state level in Connecticut? And if that also translates into an increasing competition with the Republican Party. And I know it might not mean a lot for us as people to talk about this political calculus, but I think at some level, whether you cannot relate otherwise with your interlocutor, might make up for a good reason. Rational arguments, pragmatic, directly for your interest.
So we know that the history of voting is not like extremely racialized, right? I mean, we've seen the progressive for women and for blacks to be able to have the right to vote. Again, I do not think that it is any coincidence that, we do live in an age now where we no longer have legalized segregation, but we still have the disenfranchisement of people who have been in prisons who are no longer able to vote. That means they no longer have a voice. And so I do think this is a very important issue that you're bringing up, because where would these people happen to fall if they were able to vote? What party would they vote into? And furthermore, it's just I think on a basic human rights level, you have served your time. Why is it now that we do not have the right to have a voice anymore? I think that's important, especially when you look at the statistics of what is that ratio? Who are these people that don't have a voice? So it's complicated, because I do think that we have made progress in terms of when we have discussions of racism. Sometimes I think it's a little bit difficult to grapple with or understand, because it's not about individual bias. You could sit next to a black person and have a great friend of different races, but it's about a systematized level, having our institutions catch up, having those policies that were drafted in times when we did have racist structures and having them update to be updated with our times. This is something that someone could look at and say, oh, that has nothing to do with racism. Look at the history of where it originated at. And quite likely, it's not about, oh, is this person racist? Is it a conspiracy theory of is the government out to get people or anything? But we have historical roots that we must pay attention to. So that's an excellent question, and it's an excellent, another, I think, reason that we, again, like Black Lives Matter, because this is a disenfranchisement of certain groups of people, Black and brown bodies. And possibly people who would be supporting this if they could have a voice. So all the more important to be able to give them one.
I was just going to say, with felon disenfranchisement, I do think that is a really, really important issue, just because, but it's all at the state level, which makes it kind of complicated. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know, but I think Connecticut, we do have it, but yeah, it's after you're done with probation and parole and stuff, then you get your rights, your voting rights back.
2 years.
2 years after you're done with the whole criminal justice system. Certain states, it's for life. Florida, it's for life. Florida's a swing state. That's important. But like partisanship aside, I mean, I think that there's a strange, it's just a strange concept to me that people who break the rules no longer get a say in what the rules are, is basically what that means. Which it's like, oh, if you have huge amounts of people breaking the rules, maybe those rules are bad and should be fixed, but the people who broke them no longer have a say. And so it's a really screwed up system in that sense. And so, I mean, Connecticut's better than certain states, but we have room to improve. I mean, there's a few states, I think Vermont is among them, but only a handful that don't have that policy at all. So, I mean, that's something that's definitely, I think, worth pushing for at the state level as part of the larger criminal justice reform push.
And to add, the 2 years, that is better than some states. But when we look at arrest patterns, once you've been arrested, someone's been arrested, the likelihood of reincarceration is like twice that. It's big, and it's not just let's remove the statistics. You've been arrested. Where are you going to find work? What are you going to do with your life? Where's your income coming? Who's giving you an opportunity? So we see that a lot of people, they go in and out of the system, meaning that their voice is going to be, it's like a vicious cycle of disenfranchisement and being voiceless. And so while that policy is much more progressive than Florida's, it may actually be as much of a solution as we would want it to be, because it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on it versus being more preventative in the first place and figuring out, okay, how can we stop getting people into the prison system in the first place?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, your question actually got to whether or not there was a partisan motive for all of this too, and we are very careful at the state capitol. We're very trained not to think long and hard about what motivates anybody in terms of what their position is on an issue. We do that on purpose because, you know, that's just speculation. We really try to just deal with the substance of the matter that's in front of us. What does the bill say? Are you for it or are you against it? But that doesn't mean that I'm not naive. You know, the clearest evidence I can give you that there are, you know, that there is some partisan, you know, that there's always a partisan component to the political changes, the political decisions we make, is around prison gerrymandering, right? So, you know, when we count prisoners for census purposes, we count them where they are. And so there are some small rural communities in Connecticut that look a lot bigger than they ought to be, because they've got, you know, a couple thousand prisoners who they're never gonna vote there. But the political power they get, you know, the community gets, you know, the remainder of the community gets the clout of their political power. You know, I mean, that's something that I've been interested in, sort of put my name on a bill or two through the years to try to undo that, so that we can count those people from where they count as home. And that has basically broken down on some partisan guidelines, but not entirely either. And then the other thing I would just mention, and I just want to reiterate after Dagmar was mentioning the Republican federal bill, you know, House Bill 5314 has been introduced by a Republican. So, you know, we have this issue is might be partisan, but it's not strictly partisan. You'll find folks on both sides of the issue and both sides of the aisle.
I wanted to make a point about disenfranchisement and also the 13th Amendment. It made slavery illegal except for criminals. People of color can vote except if they're criminals. So these sort of historical limitations to a lot of these rights are everywhere, and we see them built into the structure of our laws, our long-standing laws. So I think a lot of these social, kind of building off of what Caroline was saying, a lot of these social issues go together. I think it's important that any issue that's trying to deal with marijuana legalization also deals with the historical roots, the historical problems that come with prohibition. That's why I agree. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support, but I personally am a little bit critical of the libertarian aspect that sort of ignores the past, and sort of say, yeah, we have all this historical racism. Look, we disenfranchise people. We've done all these terrible, wrong things, and now we're going to make something illegal so that white people can be happy when they smoke, and a bunch of middle class and upper class white people can make a bunch of money. So that's my hesitation. I don't not to add not to necessarily say that the roots behind the libertarian approach is racist or the individuals are racist, kind of like what Kara was saying, but without addressing with the colorblind policy, will actually have racialized effects.
I think that's all the time that we have for questions today. I really appreciate everyone who attended. Again, I just want to make a shout out to my student organization, our student organization, UConn Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We meet every Thursday in ITE room 127 at 7 p.m. This is something that we'll be working on. We'll be working on this legislation. We'll be doing lobbying at the Capitol. We send emails. We make phone calls. We host forums, we testify. These are all things that you can get involved in and that you can start doing. And this isn't the only issue we work on either. So we would love to have you attend our meetings. You can find us on Facebook at UConn Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And just send a message and I will message you back, or Richie will message you back. And yeah, we'd love to have you get on board with us. So thank you again for everyone who attended today. And thank you to our lovely panelists for being here and for answering all these awesome questions.